Okay, slightly different video today. I have some beautiful Vendel Persians that are mounted up, and I've got some Gripping Beast Saracens, and they need basing. So these are mounted up for Triumph. So you can see I've got some Pavis, some Jav Cav Command, and some Archers. And what I wanted to do was take a minute to kind of go through my basing technique. And how I base the miniatures and dress out the bases so they're ready for the table. So if you stay with me, we're going to go through this video and I'll show a little bit of the basing technique over the different stages of the basing. Okay, first off, materials for basing the figures. I use laser cut wooden bases. They're 3mm thick plywood. I get these from Litco, or I cut a lot of my own because I have access to a community laser cutting area. And I usually put my figures down with super glue or a really cheap Harbor Freight version of super glue. Basically, I set the figures on the base first, and then I put drops of super glue around them so that I know they're positioned where I want. And then the super glue tends to wick under the bases and lock them down. I also find the super glue makes it possible to snap them off if I make a mistake or I want to rebase for some reason later. Other materials that are needed, the cheapest white glue you can find, a little bit of water, an old cup and some old brushes, and whatever flocking you have laying around. So this is your typical Woodland Scenic style or other brands that they make out there for the flocking. It's basically crushed up or ground up foam that's been dyed. I like a mixture of sizes. If I'm doing larger figures, I use bigger clumps. If I'm doing 15mm, I would use much finer, and you'll kind of see why as we go through the process. So I'm going to take a Persian horsebow. So these are some Vendel Persian horsebow, absolutely gorgeous figures, painted by a good friend of mine, Glenn Cooley, and supplied by Thistle and Rose now, has them back in production. So what I do is the figures are on the base, solid, dry. I take some of this glue, which is basically about 50% glue and about 50% water, maybe a little thicker depending on the glue you start with, and you apply that to the base. So you got to be careful to cover the whole base with glue, try not to get any on the figure. The reason I have two brushes here in my container is I use the smaller brush to get in between the horse's legs or the soldier's feet, and the larger brush to cover the bigger areas of the base. And usually I like to start with under the horse or under the figure first, and then work my way out to the edges. But you basically just want to slap the wet glue on here. Once the wet glue is on, and you've got some time to work with this because with the water in it especially, it doesn't dry very quickly. So we slap on the wet glue, smear it all the way to the edges, try to cover the entire base. Try to stay off of the actual sides of the base. You can clean that up later if you get some on the sides. I like to paint the sides of my bases. I don't like to have the flocking go all the way to the edge or over the side. Then take the figures and dunk it in the flocking, tap off the excess, and you'll see there might be some bare spots, which is okay. You can either touch those up a little bit or you can leave them. But now I have this kind of a nicely flocked rough surface. Now I'm not going to leave it like that. In the next stage you'll see we're actually going to paint that with some wet paint, and then we're going to dry brush it back up and then decorate it a little bit more. So I'll walk you through the rest of the stages in this video. Okay, so the next part of the process. What I've mixed up here is some black and burnt umber acrylic paint to create a nice dark paint, along with about 70% Future Floor Polish or Floor Care. It's now called Pledge. I like using that instead of water because I'm trying to thin the paint, but I still want to keep that acrylic coating. There's some water in the Pledge, of course, So it's not purely acrylic, but it tends to give a nice coating afterwards. So the goal here is to get the whole base covered in that. So this flocking that we put on the other day, you gotta watch your hands get dirty and try to keep any mess off of the figures. So I've mixed it with my old brushes, and then I like to apply it with an eyedropper. And the idea here is that this foam flocking that we have on here will actually suck up a lot of this paint and floor polish, and it'll make a nice dark base coat that we can then dry brush up to create our look. And of course I do this over this cup that I've mixed it in, because a lot of it's going to run right off into the cup to be reused, reapplied. And it's a combination of eyedropper, if it's nice and thin like this, and a brush to get into some of the spots that maybe I can't quite get with the eyedropper. But the idea here is to keep it off of the painted figures. I also keep a brush on hand in some very clean water in case I mess up or get some of this on. I like to keep this brush handy so that I can quickly wash away any dark color that might get on the actual painted figure. And as you can see, you want to drop cloth or something down because it's quite a messy process. But this look here, once it gets soaked into the base, will give me a nice brown color, or even black. Some like to use black, and this will give me something nice and dark for the shadows that I can then dry brush up. I want to give credit to Paul Potter. He's the one that originally kind of taught me this color scheme for the basing, or the idea of using the flocking and then getting it really dark with some wet paint like this, and then dry brushing up. And then I've taken it a couple notches to make it a little bit fancier than what Paul typically does. But that's how Paul gets those really great looking brown bases that he does on a lot of his 15mm armies. So this technique is gratuitously stolen from him after he taught me what he was doing for his bases, so that I could then reproduce it on some of my bases. So this is the process, and then I'll go through and do these figures up, and then I'll show you the next step in the process in the next video, the next portion of this video, as we finish off these bases. Okay, so the next step in our basing, after the liquidy acrylic mix of floor polish and dark paint has dried, then I like to go and start the process of bringing the color back up with basically lighter browns. So now I'm going to use a spice brown or maroon brown, and I'm going to start bringing this base back up. But now it's not as important to get the whole base covered, because wherever it doesn't, I don't get paint, I'll leave that show through. So basically using a large, once again, old cheap brushes, old brushes, to get the paint in there. It's good to keep some water, clean water on standby, and also a clean brush that you can use in case you accidentally slop any paint. Smaller brush to go in between horses' hooves and soldiers' feet, and then the larger brush for the bigger areas of the base. And it's not important to get the entire surface colored once again. So when I'm done with one of these ones that I did earlier, you can see some of the darker colors still showing through, and then basically with each layer of color, as I go lighter in color, I can leave more and more of the base color showing through. So I'm going to continue with these off camera, and then we'll take you through the next couple steps of bringing it up to a higher and higher color. Okay, continuing with our basing tutorial. So we started with the plain base, and we made it very dark with the acrylic mixed with the dark paint. So you can see it's an almost black look. Sometimes I go a little bit lighter. Then the next stage, we're taking it to a darker brown. So I've taken it to this dark brown by dry brushing on top of that, and pretty much covering most of what I'd already done. The next level that we're doing we're going to take lighter colors, and we'll actually do a little bit on here. And this is a base where I'm using a little bit of an orange or brown because I already have some figures that are based up this way, and this is just the technique that I used. And as you can see, I'm taking this kind of an orange-brown color and taking the color up a little bit, but with each layer of color, I'm going to go a little bit lighter on the brushing. So you can see showing more and more through. For the Persians, because I did a Greek army and Persian army, I did this slightly lighter brown. So the next level is just take successively lighter colors of brown and brush with a wet brush still, but not soaking wet, the paint up to that next layer of color. And leaving some of the colors through is great, and you can use the bigger brush. You don't have to get as close to the horse's hooves or the soldier's feet. And you're just trying to take that up the next level. So we'll keep brushing these up a little bit, and then we'll show you the end result as we get closer here to the end and what you can do with this technique. So we've done our first layer of, our second layer of brown has become a little bit lighter, and then after that layer we go even lighter, and once again as you go lighter or up in color, you go easier on the brush and you don't worry about covering every little spot, because the idea here is that you're basically highlighting. So this is, I wouldn't quite call this dry brushing, although that's technically what I'm doing, but because it's still a base, I'm still using fairly wet paint, but I'm just basically hitting the highlights. And as you can see, the ground up flocking material that we used, or foam, is now becoming more harder and harder as we put layers of paint and acrylic on it. So it's basically, what it does is it creates that texture on the base for us to highlight. You can do this with putty and epoxies, and there's acrylic gels out there, flocking gels and stuff, which are all great products. This is just a technique that I've developed from adapting the lessons learned from Paul Potter and how he was doing his bases, and I really like it because I can create different levels of texture by using different coarseness or thickness of the flocking that I start with. And it's, you know, it's cheap, it's easy, anybody can do it, and once you play around with it a little bit, you can create almost any kind of base that you want. And the key thing here is you're trying to create, you know, sort of a rough ground looking texture, because your armies didn't fight on a golf course, obviously. Probably the ground was pretty chewed up after the army was present, if it wasn't already just wild country. And then after we get done with this level, what we'll do is we'll add some details. We're going to wash this back down for this particular base. For the Greek armies that I've been doing, I've been washing the base back down, and I'll show you that step, as well as add some rocks and gravel and a little bit of dry shrub and brush work to make it look a little bit more realistic, add a little details to the base. But overall, the effect that it creates is this idea of different shading of the ground. It gives the ground more depth, and complements the figures nicely as well, I think. So we'll go to the next level, which is going to be adding some gravel, washing it back down, and then putting on some tufts of grass to show the dry grass for this area. So we'll keep watching the video, and we'll finish this up, finish up these bases, and show you the finished Persian army. Okay, so we've dry brushed up to a certain level. This one has 3 colors up from the original, and then what I'm doing now is I'm going to add some more texture by putting some stone on the base, just, you know, randomly applied. Any spot you don't like with how the paint came out, it's a good place to put some stone. We're using white glue, just Elmer's school glue. Actually not even watering this down for this purpose. So I'm just going to put a few spots around the base. And then what I do, I like to use this basically buff ballast And once again, the size depends on the scale of the figures you're using. Dip it in, tap off the excess. Now you can see that's quite a contrast there, but what we're going to do is we're going to let that dry, and then we're going to ink that back down to blend it in with the rest of the ground and give kind of a stone look. And then I'll show you the end result of that once we get to that point, and then we'll put on some tufts, and that'll finish off the base. Okay, so we've got the next step in our basing here, where we have glued some of the rocks down for texture. That's ballast from Woodland Scenics. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ink these bases back down. So the first one that I'm going to do is one of the Persians. And for the Persians, I've been using for my Persian Greek basing Vallejo dipping formula. A friend of mine suggested it primarily because it comes in a larger bottle and it's a little cheaper than some of the other inks. So if I'm doing a large surface like a base and I want to do a lot of it, it's less expensive than using some of the more traditional inks like gripping the GW Agrax Earthshade, which is real popular. And on these I actually was inking the entire base down because it's also very has a lot of orange to it. So what I'm doing here, you can see I'm dipping in my water, dipping in the ink, and I'm using the water to spread the ink out. I would not use this on this technique on a figure itself. Watering down ink has a tendency to change the characteristic of it because a lot of them are can be alcohol based. So sometimes, like if you use that water with Agrax, for example, it will tend to look foggy. But when you're doing a base, it doesn't matter because you already have a very flat looking surface. The water doesn't affect it. You can thin the ink with the water and it won't hurt anything. If you're going to thin it on a figure, you need to be more careful about what type of thinner you're using, depending on the ink that you're using. It will cause it to have some strange effects, cloudiness, other kinds of effects. So here, though, I just want to get a nice orange ground. It's basically a sepia wash that I'm using, and this it takes the yellow monotone out of the rocks that I just put down, for one thing, because I like to get them to look a little bit more natural. I don't really recommend using ballast directly onto a base without painting it or inking it or changing its color in some way. It's a little too artificial looking, I guess, for lack of a better term, because it tends to be too uniform in color. So a little bit of this ink, different places, water it down, and then it doesn't quite look the same wet as it will dry, so I'll put that one over to the side. And then here's one that I did previously, and you can see after the ink settles in there, you get a little bit different effect, and it gives you a nice ground effect. So the other technique that I'm using for the figures that I was working on in this video, this one am using the Agrax Earthshade, and it's Agrax Earthshade that I have dumped water and ballast and stuff into, so I don't use this particular bottle on figures. So I'll clean my brush a little bit. But in this technique, I'm actually going to leave the dry brush of most of what I've dry brushed alone. I'm really just going to use this ink where I put the ballast, because what I'm going for is I want to get rid of that monotone look of the ballast and kind of make the ballast blend more into the base and look a little bit more natural. So I'm really just using the ink on the ballast, not covering the entire base with it, maybe touching a few spots here and there. I'm also not watering it down as much because for these particular bases and the look that I was going for, I want that slightly darker effect. So I'm just doing the ballast, and pretty much includes that technique. And then the look that I get from that, just to give you an idea of what the finished look is, so that's what will happen when that dries. You can see that that ballast doesn't have that bright yellow shiny look to it, but it's actually looks more like blending in with the ground. And then of course I've added some tufts. So for the tufts, on the space that's dry, and I was using some homemade tufts for this. These are ones that I made myself, using a flock box, static box to create the tufts. Basically, they peel right off. You want to put a little dab of super glue down someplace where you want to locate the tuft, and then I find it's a little bit easier to deal with using tweezers. Put your tuft down onto the super glue, and then I actually find that using an X-Acto knife combined with the tweezers helps me locate the tuft as well as push it down into place. Some of the tufts will say that they're self-adhesive, the ones that you buy commercially, and they stick right on, and they do work pretty good. They will stick right on, but I still put a drop of super glue below them because I don't want them coming off later. And I find that they do have a tendency to come off if they don't have that super glue underneath them. But with a little bit of super glue, and this is that stuff I get from in packs. It's HFT. It's inexpensive. I use it for most of my basing projects. So we'll put a couple of tufts on this base, and then these figures will actually be ready for the gaming table. And you know, you can put as many as you like. It just depends on personal style. I like to use this technique. The whole purpose of this technique is partially to decorate up the base, but it's also to kind of get rid of the fact that the figures have a base on them, and you're trying to kind of hide or disguise that a little bit. In place. So as you can see, there's my tufted and ready for the table Persian Jav Cav. Once again, shout out to Thistle and Rose. These are the Vendel Persians, which are now back into production. So if you're interested in collecting a Persian army, I think they have one of the most complete lines for doing a Achaemenid early or late Persian army. So that's basically the basing technique, and like I said, these figures are ready for the table. And I appreciate you watching the video, and we'll do some more videos on playing Triumph with these figures, as well as maybe more videos on basing and painting as well.